Ethan closed the front door with the same steady hand he had used every evening for the last 12 years, but the silence inside the house no longer felt familiar. It felt borrowed. The air carried the faint scent of Olivia's favorite vanilla candle, yet even that ordinary smell seemed to belong to someone else's life now. He placed his truck keys on the kitchen counter, lined them up with his wallet out of habit, then stood perfectly still as the refrigerator hummed across the room. His heartbeat should have been racing. Instead, everything inside him slowed down. That frightened him more than anger ever could. He poured himself a glass of water and watched tiny bubbles climb the inside of the glass. Funny how the smallest things kept moving when an entire life seemed to stop. He replayed every word she had spoken, not because he wanted to suffer through it again, but because his mind refused to accept that those words had come from the woman he had promised to grow old with. The sentence echoed with mechanical precision, each repetition stripping away another layer of denial. He did not slam a cabinet. He did not throw the glass into the sink. He simply drank the water, set the glass down, and looked through the kitchen window at the backyard they had built together one weekend at a time. The oak tree they planted during their second summer had grown taller than the roof. The fence still leaned slightly where he had promised to fix it months ago. Everything outside looked exactly the same. Inside, nothing was. His phone vibrated once on the counter. Mason's name flashed across the screen. Ethan stared at it until the ringing stopped. A second later, another message appeared. "Just checking in, buddy. Everything good?" Ethan read the sentence twice. The words looked harmless, almost caring. He placed the phone face down without replying. That was the moment a quiet thought entered his mind. If people are willing to lie about one thing, how many other lies have been hiding in plain sight? He walked slowly toward the hallway, passing framed photographs that had once represented certainty. A beach vacation in Florida, Thanksgiving with both families. A charity race where Mason had crossed the finish line beside him with matching medals around their necks. Ethan lifted one frame from the wall. 3 smiling faces stared back at him. His own smile looked genuine. Mason had one arm around his shoulder. Olivia leaned comfortably between them. Looking at the picture now, Ethan could not decide whether he had missed the truth or whether the truth had simply arrived later. That uncertainty settled heavier than any accusation could. Upstairs, their bedroom remained perfectly organized. Olivia always folded blankets with sharp corners and arranged decorative pillows no one actually used. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and noticed something he had ignored for months. Her side of the closet contained fewer everyday clothes than he remembered. Several empty hangers swayed gently after he slid the door open. Maybe she had donated old outfits. Maybe she had moved things to storage. Maybe there had been signs all along disguised as ordinary changes that busy husbands never questioned. His chest tightened, not because he had found proof, but because he realized how easily routine can disguise distance. He opened the top drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a small leather notebook where he occasionally wrote reminders about work projects and home repairs. He turned to a blank page. For several seconds the pen hovered without touching the paper. Finally, he wrote one sentence. Facts only. No assumptions. He underlined it once, then closed the notebook. Whatever happened next would not be driven by panic. It would be driven by truth. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The forecast had mentioned scattered showers, but Ethan had forgotten. He walked back downstairs, switched off the television before realizing it had never been turned on, and listened to the quiet rhythm of rain filling the empty spaces in the house. His phone vibrated again. This time it was Olivia. The screen lit up with 3 simple words. "We should talk." Ethan read them without expression. Hours earlier those words would have filled him with hope. Now they felt like another move in a game whose rules had changed without his knowledge. He locked the screen, placed the phone beside the notebook, and looked through the darkened window as water rolled down the glass in slow, uneven lines. Somewhere beneath the disappointment, beneath the confusion, beneath the memories he had not yet figured out how to carry, a different feeling quietly emerged. It was not revenge. It was not hatred. It was clarity. For the first time that evening, he understood something important. His next decision would shape the rest of his life, and he intended to make it with a clear mind instead of a broken heart. Ethan woke before sunrise, not because he had slept well, but because his mind refused to stay quiet any longer. The digital clock beside the bed read 5:38. For For years he had started every weekday at nearly the same time, brewing coffee before the neighborhood stirred awake, checking the weather, and leaving for work while the streets were still empty. Routine had always been his anchor. This morning it became his disguise. He showered, buttoned a light blue work shirt, tied his boots, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back appeared exactly the same as yesterday. The difference lived somewhere behind his eyes. Downstairs, the coffee maker hissed softly as dark roast filled the kitchen with a familiar smell. Ethan wrapped both hands around the warm mug without taking a sip. He reached for the leather notebook again and opened to the page that contained only 3 words. Facts only. No assumptions. Beneath them he wrote the date, then listed everything he knew with absolute certainty. Olivia had admitted the relationship herself. Mason had sent a message pretending everything was normal. Olivia wanted another conversation. Everything else belonged in a different category. Questions were not answers. Feelings were not evidence. That simple distinction steadied his breathing. On the drive to work, the highway looked no different than it had every other Tuesday. Pickup trucks merged into traffic. School buses stopped every few blocks. A construction crew poured fresh concrete beside an exit ramp. Ordinary life continued with remarkable indifference to private heartbreak. Ethan found that strangely comforting. The world did not owe him a pause simply because his own had cracked. At the office, his co-workers greeted him with casual smiles. One asked about a football game. Another joked about the weather forecast calling for another week of rain. Ethan answered politely, careful to sound exactly like himself. Keeping his voice steady required less effort than he expected. The real struggle came every time his phone vibrated in his pocket. Shortly after lunch, another message from Olivia appeared. Can we please talk tonight? He stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it again without replying. Silence was not punishment. Silence was time. Time allowed emotions to settle, while truth became easier to recognize. Late that afternoon, Ethan stopped at a grocery store on the way home. He pushed the shopping cart through bright aisles lined with familiar brands, picking up coffee filters, milk, bread, and a bag of apples. At the checkout lane, an elderly cashier smiled and asked how his day had been. Good, thank you, he answered automatically. The words left his mouth before he had time to consider whether they were true. Walking back to the truck, he realized how often people answered questions with habit instead of honesty. Perhaps marriages sometimes work the same way. We are fine became easier to say than we are drifting apart. The rain had returned by the time he reached home. Small drops tapped rhythmically against the windshield while he sat in the driveway with the engine idling. Through the front window, he could see the warm glow of the living room lamp. Olivia was already home. Her silhouette moved briefly across the curtains before disappearing into another room. Ethan switched off the engine and remained seated for one more minute. He reminded himself that calm was a decision repeated one breath at a time. When he finally stepped inside, Olivia looked up from the kitchen island. Her face carried the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had expected a very different reaction than the one she received. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence between them stretched longer than either expected. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. We cannot keep avoiding this. Ethan placed the grocery bags on the counter one at a time before answering. I am not avoiding anything. I am making sure I understand what is real before I decide what comes next. The sentence landed softly, but it stayed in the room long after the words ended. Olivia looked away toward the window where rain continued tracing slow lines across the glass. Ethan noticed something else for the first time. She seemed uncomfortable with quiet. She kept adjusting a coffee mug that did not need moving, smoothing the sleeve of her sweater, glancing toward her phone without picking it up. He remembered something an old supervisor had once told him during a difficult contract negotiation. People become impatient when they believe they already control the outcome. Unexpected patience changes the entire conversation. Ethan did not know where the road ahead would lead, but he understood one thing with complete certainty. The man who had walked into this house the previous evening no longer existed. In his place stood someone willing to wait for the complete picture before making the most important decision of his life. Ethan did not rush upstairs after their conversation ended. He remained in the kitchen long after Olivia disappeared into the bedroom, listening to the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. The house had become strangely quiet, yet every familiar sound seemed louder than before. The refrigerator cycled on. The old wall clock marked another minute. Somewhere outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly down the street. Ordinary sounds had replaced ordinary conversations. Ethan picked up his notebook once again and added another line beneath yesterday's notes. Stay patient. Patterns reveal themselves when people believe you have stopped paying attention. He closed the cover carefully and placed it beside his coffee mug. The following morning began almost exactly like the one before. Olivia left the house 20 minutes earlier than usual, mentioning an early meeting while collecting her laptop bag. Ethan smiled politely, wished her a good day, and watched through the front window as her SUV disappeared around the corner. Only after the taillights vanished did he glance at the kitchen calendar. Something caught his attention. The meeting she mentioned had not appeared on the shared family calendar, even though she normally scheduled everything from work conferences to dentist appointments. It was a small detail. Alone, it meant nothing. Together with everything else, it deserved to be remembered. At work, Ethan found himself paying closer attention to details than ever before. He noticed how easily people revealed themselves through habits instead of words. One coworker always checked his watch before difficult conversations. Another smiled whenever she felt uncomfortable. Human behavior followed patterns, and patterns rarely disappeared overnight. During lunch, he remembered something Mason used to say whenever they played golf together on Saturday mornings. If you want to understand a course, stop looking at the flag and start reading the ground beneath your feet. Funny how advice meant for golf suddenly applied to life itself. Ethan realized he had spent years trusting the flag while ignoring the ground. That evening, he returned home before Olivia. The house remained exactly as they had left it. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long golden lines, and dust floated lazily through the air near the living room window. Ethan walked slowly through each room, not searching for dramatic discoveries, but simply observing. He noticed unopened mail stacked neatly beside the fruit bowl. A dry cleaning receipt rested beneath a cookbook on the counter. The laundry room contained an empty garment bag he had never seen before. None of these objects proved anything, yet each reminded him how much of daily life passed unnoticed until routine was interrupted. His phone buzzed unexpectedly. Mason. Ethan answered after the third ring. Mason's voice sounded cheerful, almost effortless. Hey, brother. I have not seen you in weeks. We should grab dinner this weekend. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter and stared through the window into the backyard. That sounds good, he replied evenly. Let me check my schedule. They exchanged a few more ordinary sentences before ending the call. Ethan stood perfectly still after the line disconnected. The conversation had been remarkably normal. Too normal. If Mason knew nothing, then his confidence made sense. If Mason knew everything, the confidence meant something entirely different. Ethan refused to guess which explanation was true. He simply wrote another note in his notebook. Mason suggested dinner. Voice relaxed. No hesitation. Facts only. Later that night, Olivia returned home carrying takeout containers from a local Italian restaurant. I thought neither of us felt like cooking, she said with a tired smile. Ethan thanked her and helped set the table. They discussed traffic, grocery prices, and a neighbor planning to replace an old fence. The conversation sounded almost identical to hundreds they had shared before. Yet beneath every ordinary sentence lived an entirely different reality neither of them acknowledged directly. Ethan noticed Olivia checking her phone several times during dinner before turning it face down beside her plate. Months ago, he would not have thought twice about the gesture. Tonight, he simply noticed it without commenting. Observation required no confrontation. After dinner, Olivia quietly asked, "Are you ever going to tell me what you are thinking?" Ethan folded his napkin carefully before answering. "I am thinking that important decisions deserve complete understanding, not immediate reactions." She searched his face for several long seconds as though expecting anger to appear eventually. It never did. Instead, she found patience, and patience seemed to unsettle her far more than shouting ever could have. That night, lying awake in the darkness, Ethan finally understood that the hardest part of uncovering the truth was not collecting information. It was resisting the temptation to fill empty spaces with assumptions. The facts would arrive in their own time. Until then, silence remained his strongest ally, and every quiet day revealed more than any argument ever could. The next several days settled into a rhythm that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, and that was exactly what made them so revealing. Ethan stopped trying to predict what Olivia or Mason might do next. Instead, he paid attention to what they actually did. Every morning, he left for work at the same time. Every evening, he came home without changing his routine. He laughed politely when neighbors waved from across the street. He mowed the lawn on Saturday morning because the grass had grown too high after another week of rain. Normal life became the safest place to hide careful observation. Late Friday afternoon, while organizing old warranty papers inside the home office, Ethan reached for a file cabinet that had not been opened in months. He was searching for insurance documents after remembering the annual renewal was approaching. As he sorted through neatly labeled folders, he noticed that several financial statements had been removed from their usual place. The labels remained, but the contents were missing. He paused without allowing emotion to rush ahead of reason. There could be dozens of innocent explanations. Perhaps Olivia had taken them to review household expenses. Perhaps they had been moved into another folder. Rather than guessing, he simply wrote another note in his notebook. Financial records relocated. Verify later. Facts only. That evening, Olivia appeared unusually relaxed. She suggested ordering pizza, recommended watching an old comedy they both enjoyed, and even laughed at a joke Ethan had heard her dismiss months earlier. The warmth felt almost rehearsed, as though someone had suddenly remembered the lines to a play after forgetting them for an entire season. Ethan smiled politely, but something inside him remained still. He had learned that consistency often revealed more than dramatic moments. People rarely changed overnight. During the movie, Olivia excused herself twice to answer messages in another room. She returned each time with the same calm expression, yet her phone never left her hand for long. Ethan noticed the pattern without mentioning it. Observation required patience, and patience was beginning to feel less like waiting and more like preparation. The following Monday, he scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor under the simple explanation that he wanted to review long-term planning. The advisor welcomed him into a quiet office overlooking downtown. Sunlight reflected from nearby glass buildings, while traffic moved steadily several stories below. Ethan explained that he wanted to understand every account carrying his name, every shared obligation, every automatic payment, and every document connected to the household. He did not accuse anyone. He simply asked questions. By the end of the meeting, he walked away with copies of records, a clearer understanding of their finances, and one important realization. Knowledge reduced fear. Uncertainty had been exhausting. Facts felt lighter. On his drive home, he remembered a conversation his father had shared years earlier while repairing an old pickup truck. You never fix an engine by guessing which part is broken. You inspect everything before turning the first wrench. At the time, Ethan thought the lesson was about machines. Now he understood it had always been about life. That evening, Mason called again, his voice carrying the same easy confidence as before. He suggested a fishing trip later in the month, joking that they both needed a break from work. Ethan agreed that fresh air sounded nice, then ended the conversation after only a few minutes. When the call finished, he noticed something unexpected. He no longer felt the sharp ache that had followed every interaction during the first days. Pain had begun changing into clarity. The difference surprised him. Clarity did not erase disappointment. It simply prevented disappointment from making decisions on his behalf. Later that night, Olivia found Ethan sitting alone on the back porch watching the last light disappear behind the oak tree. She stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee and quietly handed him one. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The cool evening breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "You seem different." Ethan looked across the yard before answering. "Maybe I finally stopped asking why and started asking what comes next." She lowered her eyes toward the porch floor, turning her coffee mug slowly between both hands. It was the first time since everything changed that she appeared unsure of herself. Ethan did not press for explanations. He had discovered something far more valuable than immediate answers. Time had a way of exposing intentions that words tried to conceal. As the porch light cast long shadows across the wooden deck, Ethan realized he no longer feared whatever truth remained hidden. One piece at a time, the picture was becoming complete, and for the first time since his world shifted, he felt prepared to face whatever the next page of his life might reveal. Ethan discovered that once he stopped chasing answers, answers had a way of quietly finding him. The following week passed with the same familiar rhythm that had defined his life for years. He left for work before sunrise, returned home before dark whenever possible, and kept every promise he made to himself. He listened more than he spoke. He watched more than he reacted. That discipline slowly transformed confusion into confidence. One Thursday afternoon, while reviewing several household accounts on his laptop after work, he noticed something that had escaped his attention for months. A shared savings account had experienced a series of small transfers spread over nearly a year. None of them were large enough to trigger concern individually. $100 here, $200 there. A few subscription charges that no longer matched services they actually used. Together they formed a pattern rather than an accident. Ethan compared the statements with older records stored in a separate folder. The timing matched periods when Olivia had mentioned unexpected work expenses or professional networking events. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. The room remained perfectly quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioner. He did not assume wrongdoing. He simply recognized another detail that deserved to be understood before any major decision was made. He printed the statements, placed them into a new folder labeled Household Records, and added another sentence to his notebook. Small details become important when they repeat. Later that evening, Olivia walked through the front door carrying grocery bags and smiling more warmly than she had in weeks. She spoke about a successful meeting, a coworker celebrating a promotion, and a new restaurant everyone wanted to try. Ethan listened without interrupting. Her stories sounded effortless, yet he noticed she skipped over specific names and exact times that she normally mentioned without thinking. It was not the absence of information that caught his attention. It was the change from her usual habits. During dinner, she asked whether he wanted to take a weekend trip to the lake like they used to every summer. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. Maybe someday. Right now I think we both need honesty more than scenery. Olivia lowered her eyes and quietly nodded. Neither of them spoke again until the plates had been cleared from the table. That night, Ethan received an unexpected email from his financial advisor confirming that every document he had requested was complete and available through the secure client portal. He logged in after Olivia had gone upstairs and carefully reviewed each report. Everything connected to the mortgage, retirement accounts, insurance policies, and investment statements appeared organized. Nothing dramatic jumped off the page. Instead, what gave him peace was knowing that uncertainty continued shrinking with every verified fact. He realized something important as he closed the final document. Fear grows fastest inside empty spaces. Knowledge fills those spaces one fact at a time. The following afternoon, Mason stopped by Ethan's workplace without warning, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the same easy smile that had once represented years of friendship. He joked about how long it had been since they had talked face to face and suggested getting together after work. Ethan accepted the coffee, thanked him sincerely, and carried on a conversation that sounded almost identical to dozens they had shared over the years. Yet beneath every ordinary sentence, Ethan quietly observed small things he would never have noticed before. Mason avoided direct eye contact whenever family came up in conversation. He changed subjects unusually quickly whenever Olivia's name entered the discussion. He checked his phone twice during a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. None of those moments proved anything by themselves. Together, they painted a picture of someone carrying a weight he preferred not to discuss. As Mason drove away, Ethan remained standing beside the parking lot for several moments, watching afternoon sunlight reflect across rows of parked trucks. He remembered how often he had mistaken familiarity for certainty. Knowing someone for many years did not mean knowing every decision they were capable of making. On the drive home, he rolled the windows down and let the cool evening air fill the cab of his truck. The open road felt strangely peaceful. He was no longer waiting for his life to return to what it had been. He was preparing for whatever it was about to become. When he arrived home, he placed the growing folder of financial records beside his notebook and looked at both for several seconds. One contained numbers. The other contained observations. Together, they represented something far more valuable than evidence alone. They represented clarity. Ethan finally understood that truth rarely arrived with dramatic music or a single shocking moment. More often it appeared quietly, piece by piece, until one day the entire picture stood clearly in front of you. As he switched off the office light and walked toward the hallway, He felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over him. Whatever conversation awaited in the days ahead, he would enter it with a clear mind, steady hands, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing he had chosen patience over panic every step of the way. Monday morning arrived with clear skies after nearly 2 weeks of rain, and for the first time in a long while Ethan noticed the sunrise instead of the weight he had been carrying. The orange light stretched across the windshield as he drove toward work, illuminating the notebook resting on the passenger seat. He had stopped thinking of it as a record of disappointment. It had become something else entirely. It was proof that calm decisions created stronger foundations than emotional reactions ever could. During his lunch break, his attorney called to confirm that every document Ethan had gathered had been organized and reviewed. Nothing in the conversation sounded dramatic. There were no shocking announcements, no urgent warnings, only careful advice delivered with quiet confidence. Keep everything documented. Continue communicating respectfully. Make decisions based on verified information, not assumptions. When the call ended, Ethan felt something he had not experienced since this chapter of his life began. Direction. That evening he returned home to find Olivia sitting alone on the back porch. A cool breeze moved through the oak tree, scattering a few early autumn leaves across the yard. She looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The moment she saw Ethan, she stood and asked if they could finally have the conversation both of them had postponed for days. Ethan nodded once and pulled out the chair across from her. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Someone several houses away was grilling dinner. Children laughed as bicycles rolled along the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued all around them. Olivia finally spoke first. "I never expected you to become this quiet. I thought you would argue. I thought you would tell me I was wrong." Ethan looked toward the fence he had promised himself he would repair before winter arrived. "Sometimes silence is not surrender," he answered. "Sometimes it is the only way to hear what is actually happening." She lowered her eyes and admitted that she had spent the past week trying to understand why he had remained so composed. Every day she had expected anger, accusations, or desperate attempts to change her mind. Instead, she found patience, and that patience had forced her to confront questions she had avoided asking herself. Ethan listened without interrupting. He realized that people often revealed their deepest thoughts when they no longer felt pushed into defending themselves. After several moments, he reached into the folder he had carried home from work and placed several neatly organized documents on the table. They were not surprises designed to embarrass anyone. They were simple financial summaries, household records, and written notes showing the practical steps required if they chose separate paths. Olivia looked at the papers with visible surprise. "You already prepared all of this?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Preparation is not punishment," he replied. "It is responsibility. I needed to understand my own future before making decisions about it." She slowly turned through the pages without speaking. The calm organization seemed to affect her more than raised voices ever could have. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempts to assign blame. Only clarity. As the evening light faded, Olivia admitted that she had underestimated him. She had mistaken kindness for dependence and patience for weakness. Ethan answered with the same steady tone he had carried for days. "Being calm does not mean being unaware. It means refusing to let fear decide what comes next." The words settled between them like stones placed carefully into a foundation. Neither person argued with them because neither person could. Darkness gradually covered the backyard while porch lights flickered on throughout the neighborhood. Ethan gathered the documents back into the folder, not because the conversation was over, but because the next steps would require careful choices rather than emotional ones. As he stood to walk inside, he noticed something had quietly changed. The uncertainty that had filled the house only days before had begun to disappear. In its place stood something much stronger. The truth no longer felt like a distant destination. It was becoming the ground beneath his feet, and for the first time since everything had changed, Ethan realized he was no longer simply enduring the end of one chapter. He was deliberately building the beginning of another. The days that followed no longer felt uncertain. They felt deliberate. Ethan noticed the difference the moment he woke each morning. He no longer reached for his phone hoping to find an explanation that would somehow restore the past. Instead, he reached for his notebook. Every page reminded him that calm had carried him farther than panic ever could. His attorney continued organizing the paperwork while Ethan quietly gathered the remaining documents connected to the house, the vehicles, the insurance policies, and every shared financial account. Each completed task removed another layer of anxiety. The process was not about winning against someone else. It was about making sure his future rested on facts instead of confusion. One afternoon, he returned home earlier than expected after a meeting at work had been canceled. The house was empty, and for the first time in weeks the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Sunlight poured through the living room windows, illuminating framed photographs that had remained untouched since everything changed. Ethan walked slowly along the hallway and paused in front of the family pictures. He studied each one carefully. Birthdays, vacations, backyard cookouts, fishing trips with Mason, anniversary dinners with Olivia. The photographs had not lied. The moments had been real when they happened. Real memories could still exist, even if later choices changed the story that followed. That realization surprised him. He had spent days believing every happy memory had somehow become meaningless. Now he understood something different. The past did not disappear simply because the future took another direction. He gently removed one photograph from the wall, placed it inside a storage box, and continued packing a few personal keepsakes that he planned to take with him when the legal process was complete. He was not erasing his history. He was organizing it. Later that evening, Olivia arrived home, carrying several shopping bags. She stopped in the hallway after noticing the neatly labeled storage boxes stacked against the wall. For a long moment, she simply looked at them without speaking. Finally, she asked, "Are you really preparing to move forward?" Ethan answered honestly, "I started moving forward the day I stopped waiting for someone else to decide my future." His voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet the words carried a quiet certainty that neither of them could ignore. Olivia sat down in the living room and admitted that she had believed there would eventually be an emotional confrontation, a dramatic turning point that would somehow reset everything. Instead, she had watched Ethan become more focused, more organized, and somehow stronger with every passing day. She confessed that she no longer recognized the quiet confidence she now saw in him. Ethan nodded slowly. "Neither do I," he said with a faint smile. "But maybe this version of me was always there. Maybe I just never had a reason to meet him until now." The conversation drifted into a long silence. Outside, autumn leaves rolled across the driveway as a cool breeze moved through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had, reminding Ethan that seasons changed whether people were ready or not. Before going upstairs, Olivia paused beside the dining room table where Ethan's notebook rested. She looked at it for several seconds before quietly asking what he had been writing all this time. Ethan opened the notebook and turned it toward her. Every page contained dates, observations, reminders, and one sentence repeated again and again in slightly different forms. "Stay calm. Stay honest. Stay with the facts." Olivia slowly closed the notebook and rested her hand on its cover. "I thought silence meant you had stopped caring," she admitted. Ethan looked out the window before answering. "Silence did not mean I stopped caring. It meant I started respecting myself enough to think clearly before making permanent decisions." The room became still again. No raised voices filled the house. No accusations echoed through the hallway. The truth had already done everything loud words could never accomplish. That night, Ethan carried another storage box into the garage and placed it beside the others. As he switched off the overhead light, he noticed how different the garage looked with several boxes waiting near the door. They were simple cardboard containers, yet they represented something much larger. They represented movement. They represented preparation instead of hesitation. Most importantly, they represented a future that Ethan was finally building with intention rather than fear. Standing there in the quiet darkness, he realized that healing had not arrived all at once. It had appeared one steady decision at a time until one evening, he looked around and discovered that hope had quietly taken the place where uncertainty used to live. 8 months later, I found myself standing on the back deck of a small house overlooking a quiet lake just outside the city. The morning air carried the smell of pine trees and fresh coffee instead of uncertainty. A pair of ducks drifted across the still water while sunlight painted long reflections across the surface. I had imagined for years that peace would arrive like a celebration. Instead, it arrived almost unnoticed through ordinary mornings that no longer felt heavy. My new routine had become surprisingly simple. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, read a few pages from a book instead of checking my phone, and drove to work without replaying old conversations inside my head. Some people believe healing begins the day life becomes perfect. Mine began the day I stopped measuring every new moment against the past. The legal process had ended respectfully and without unnecessary conflict because both sides eventually agreed that moving forward served everyone better than remaining trapped inside what could no longer be repaired. We divided responsibilities fairly, signed the final documents, and walked away with something far more valuable than winning an argument. We walked away with the chance to begin again. I never learned every answer to every question, and eventually I realized I no longer needed them. Not every mystery deserves a lifetime of attention. Some chapters are meant to close even if a few pages remain unread. Every now and then I still received messages from mutual friends asking how I was doing. Their voices carried curiosity at first, then relief after they heard the calm in my answers. I never spoke badly about Olivia. I never tried to convince anyone to choose sides. People eventually noticed the difference between someone chasing validation and someone quietly rebuilding a meaningful life. Reputation, I discovered, grows strongest when it is supported by consistent actions instead of carefully crafted explanations. One Saturday afternoon, I ran into Mason at a local hardware store. The encounter lasted less than 5 minutes. We exchanged polite greetings, spoke briefly about work, and wished each other well before walking in different directions. There was no dramatic confrontation waiting at the end of that aisle. There did not need to be. Time had already accomplished what anger never could. As I pushed my shopping cart toward the parking lot, I realized I felt neither resentment nor satisfaction. I simply felt finished. That surprised me more than anything else. I had once believed forgiveness meant pretending nothing had happened. Now I understood it meant refusing to let yesterday continue renting space inside tomorrow. Later that evening, I opened the same leather notebook that had traveled with me through every difficult day. The pages contained observations, dates, reminders, and lessons written during moments when life felt uncertain. I turned slowly through each page until I reached the final blank sheet. For several minutes, I looked out the window at the lake before writing one last sentence. The strongest foundation I ever built was not a house, a career, or a marriage. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. I closed the notebook, placed it on the bookshelf beside a row of family photographs, and smiled quietly. The photographs were still there because they represented real moments from a real life. They no longer represented the future, but they did not need to disappear in order for a new future to exist. Healing had taught me that gratitude and acceptance could share the same space. Looking back now, I do not remember that season of my life as the time everything fell apart. I remember it as the season that forced me to become the man I should have been all along. Calm replaced fear. Clarity replaced confusion. Purpose replaced hesitation. If there is one lesson I carry into every new sunrise, it is this. The people around you will sometimes change without warning, circumstances will shift beyond your control, and plans you believed were permanent may suddenly come to an end. But character remains a choice repeated every single day. When life asked me who I wanted to become after everything changed, I finally understood that the answer was never hidden inside someone else's decisions. It had always been waiting inside my own.